Paul pivots in this passage, right? He's talking about this thing all the way up through verse 9 about, doing the right thing and not doing the wrong thing and the natural order of things and all those kinds of things. But then he pivots in verse 11 and he's basically what he's doing is I need to drive home the point of my whole letter at this point. I need to make sure here at the very end that they're paying attention to the right things. And so he says in verse 11, see with what large letters I'm writing to you with my own hand. Now, commentators think that Paul literally took up the pen at this point to drive home. We don't have the original autograph, so we don't know. But we think that what he did was he actually took up the pen to drive home his point, to accentuate how important it was, the things that he was about to say. This, everybody, pay attention. This is what's so important. Well, what is it? Well, in verse 12 and 13, he talks about what people boast about. And then he says in verse 14, but far be it from me to boast, except in the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ, by which the world has been crucified to me and I to the world. See, this is what is so important that Paul needed to drive it home. The absolute centrality of the cross to everything that he's about, to everything that we should be about. There is literally nothing more important in terms of our lives. In fact, there's a Greek construction that Paul uses at the beginning of verse 14. He says, meganoita. And I know that Adam is nodding his head because he knows exactly what this construction means. It's among the strongest negative sentences or statements that you can make in Koine Greek. It literally means, may it never be. That's the best we can do with English of this construction. I really like the King James on this translation, even though the King James has got it wrong. Because the King James brings out the sense for us. The King James says, God forbid that I would boast in anything except the cross of Jesus Christ. God isn't in that phrase at all. That's why I say the King James has got it wrong. But that's okay, because the gist of it is right. Meganoita, God forbid, may it never be that I should boast in anything except the cross of Christ. The cross is the centerpiece of everything. It's where all of our pride should be focused. It's all we should boast about. Not our heritage, not our education, not our accomplishments, not our holiness, as if there was such a thing without the cross of Christ. Not in who we get to follow us. Some people are just interested in gaining followings. Just the cross and the cross alone. In 1 Corinthians 2, Paul says, for I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. Now that doesn't mean that nothing Jesus Christ said or did other than the cross matters. That's not what he's saying. But the cross is what validates everything else Jesus said or did. You need to get this right. Paul didn't say, I boast in the Sermon on the Mount. He didn't say that. Why? Because what Jesus did is what brought reconciliation, not what he taught. What he did makes it possible to live out what he said. If he came and taught and didn't die, big deal. So many people want to make Jesus' statements a religious system. You'd be a good Christian if you turn the other cheek, if you forgive your neighbor, if you give to the poor, if you don't judge. No. But you'll be more religious. That's true. You'll be more acceptable to your fellow man if you do all those things. That's the boasting, by the way, of verse 12 and 13 that Paul brings out. People who want to make a good showing of their flesh. But those things without the cross will not and cannot make you more acceptable to God. And that's why Paul said, I only boast in the cross. I only want to know the cross. Anything else we put ahead of the cross is going to get us sideways. Let me give you an example of this. Look at the story of Peter's confession. If you remember the story, it takes place in Matthew chapter 16. Jesus asks his disciples, who do the people say I am? And they kind of say, well, you're a good teacher, and you're this, or you're that. And he says, well, who do you say I am? And Peter pipes up and he's like, I've got this, guys. Peter says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus basically says, right. He says, flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And from then on, Matthew tells us, from that confession forward, the whole tenor of Jesus' purpose and teaching of the disciples changes. Verse 21 of chapter 16 says, from that time Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and on the third day be raised. He's basically saying, guys, here's the plan. We're going to wander around for a while. We're not going to accomplish anything that you consider to be an accomplishment. And then I'm going to go to Jerusalem and I'm going to die. Won't that be great? Peter did not like that agenda. Verse 22, Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Can you imagine rebuking Jesus? Even though Peter's confession is correct, Peter doesn't get it. Peter is at odds. His whole purpose is at odds with Jesus' testimony about himself. And so that's why he thinks he's right to be able to rebuke Jesus, because my design for you is different, Jesus. And so Jesus hears Peter, and of course, because of what he taught on the Sermon on the Mount, he's like, oh, Peter, you are so right. That was a very insensitive thing for me to say. I am so sorry that I offended you. Will you please forgive me? I don't want to judge you, Peter. So let's try and work together and figure this thing out together. No, of course he doesn't say that. Jesus turned to Peter and he said, get behind me, Satan, for you're a hindrance to me. You're not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man. Wow, that sounds really judgy. Yeah, you think? And see, Peter was quite all right with Jesus as long as Peter's ideas about the end time and how Jesus was going to bring about things, as long as Peter's perception about those things were honored. He was fine. Jesus can be a political leader. He can be a teacher. He can teach us how to pray. He can teach us how to approach God. He can teach us how to deal with our troubles, how to love each other, how to get along. But as soon as Jesus says, my whole purpose is to come here and to die for you, well, then Peter couldn't handle it. See, this is so important. Look. You and I, we are in the grip of Satan himself if we don't agree with this, what Jesus came to do. The main thing that Jesus came to do was to die. It was not to walk around with us and be a good example for us. He did that. But God forbid that anything else would have centrality in your head, in your mind, in your heart before the cross. Of course, after the resurrection, all of the apostles get it, right? They finally figured out, it's like, oh, of course it took the Holy Spirit for them to really, really understand it. And so some of the disciples, you may be aware of this, they wrote 4 biographies about Jesus. That's what a gospel is, right? It's a biography about Jesus. You realize what John does with his gospel? Like, have you ever thought about the fact that in John, he skips right over the birth? He doesn't talk about the birth of Jesus at all. Have you ever asked why? He just skips right over. He launches right into Jesus' ministry. But John doesn't even really record all that much about Jesus' ministry, right? When you get to chapter 12, you know what happens in chapter 12? We transition in the Gospel of John to this week, the week we're celebrating, right? We start talking about Holy Week, about Passion Week. And from chapter 12, virtually half the Gospel, that's all John talks about, is this last week of Jesus, the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus in that last week. Why? Why does he do that? Why is that the main focus? Because John and the rest of the disciples realized it's all about the cross. They boasted in the cross. They realized this is it. This is everything. This means if we don't get this right, we won't get anything right. And so at the very end of his gospel, John says this. Now, there are also many other things that Jesus did. Were every one of them to be written, I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. Right? Do you see that? There are many, many other things that Jesus said and did. And I could fill hundreds, thousands of books with them. But I'm not going to, says John. Think about that. Like, in my Bible, the Gospel of John is 25 pages. That's it. 25 pages. John says, I could have filled thousands of books with the deeds of Jesus, but nah. Why? Because it's the one thing Jesus did that really matters. If it's all about his teachings, right? Let's just play this game. If it's all about his teaching and how he lived, if that's all that mattered, our Bible would be huge. Like we'd have to have, every church would have to have a separate room to contain the Bible. You could go in and you could take out a volume. What did Jesus do when he was 33 years old and 11 weeks? You take out 11 books about that week. Right? If it was all about what he did and what he taught, then our Bibles would be immense. But honestly, here's the truth of it. The world doesn't need another moral teacher. That's the truth of it. If that's the most important part of Jesus, ask yourself this. Would that really change anything? Would it really change anything if he was just a teacher? Would that change anything in the world? Even if you grant that Jesus was the absolute best moral teacher, even if you grant that he had the most fine-tuned, he had the most wise, he had the most balanced set of teachings that have ever existed in history, which of course he does, would that by itself really change anything in our world? No, it wouldn't. Because that's not what the world needs. The world doesn't need another system. The world needs a new heart. The world doesn't need a set of ethics. We already have that. The world needs something to smash and destroy the chains of sin that bind us. We need power. We need a new nature.